dizer nada de especial. Sou o professor Ingold, do qual, aliás, já disse que é uma pessoa excepcional e, portanto, transcende, como todas as pessoas excepcionais, o domínio disciplinar da Tecnologia, à qual se dedicou durante toda uma vida, para ser interessante para todas as pessoas que se interessam pela questão das ciências sociais e humanas, ou pelas questões que as ciências sociais e humanas abordam, e não só, porque o professor Ingold tem uma forte influência das ciências naturais. Ele é filho de um famoso especialista de micologia, microflora, perdão, e teve muita influência do pai e muita influência das ciências naturais na sua formação original, que ainda hoje se nota naquilo que se pensa e escreve. Portanto, vocês têm na internet, aqueles que têm Facebook, se forem à página da Sociedade Portuguesa de Tecnologia, têm lá realmente elementos sobre a Conferência de hoje e sobre a Conferência da manhã, sobre a Congresso em geral, e sobre a Conferência da manhã, também na página do CITCEM, e, além disso, existem na internet muitos vídeos no YouTube com conferências, com intervenções do professor Ingold, que eu às vezes passo horas regalado a ouvir, não é? Com a devida calma e com os fones, para poder perceber bem o que é que ele está a dizer, e é o que estamos também aqui a fazer hoje. Eu vou pedir a todas as pessoas, como aliás já também não devia ter feito, mas enfim, está bem implícito, a autorização para gravar e para pôr na internet. Não vamos filmar provavelmente a assistência, se filmarmos é uma passagem rápida, não é? O que interessa é filmarmos a conferência do professor Ingold. Portanto, estamos perante uma das figuras, realmente, da cultura europeia mais importantes do nosso século, do século anterior e do nosso, com uma larga trajetória. A sua biografia, a sua bibliografia, não é? Em livros que hoje em dia são lidos nas universidades como clássicos, nomeadamente um livro em que ele reuniu 20 anos de trabalho, que se chama The Perception of the Environment, é um clássico absoluto, mas também outros, Being Alive, Making, e um último livro, por exemplo, sobre a questão da educação, que é extremamente importante. Portanto, a obra do professor Ingold é realmente avassaladora e extremamente interessante. Portanto, eu não vou dizer mais nada. Please, start talk. It's not me who is going to occupy more time, and we need to thank you again for your generosity to come to us and to explore your ideas. Always so pleasant. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be back in Porto. I'll just allow a few seconds for everybody to get themselves comfortable with my opinion. Is it not? Okay. No, it's okay. So I'll just wait for everybody to be seated. Okay, well, again, thank you very much for having me. It's lovely to be back in a warm and sunny Porto. So I shall begin, and I hope that you can follow my English. But if there's any problem, you know, in hearing English and you're losing the plot, just put your hand up or something, and we can go over things again. The greater part of what we know, we cannot explain. And this is savoir-faire, or know-how. The philosopher Michael Polanyi called it personal knowledge. That is, knowledge that adheres so closely to the person as the practitioner that it cannot be held up to scrutiny or posited as an object of reflection or analysis. But without it, Polanyi argued, nothing could be practicably accomplished. We couldn't tie our shoelaces, or beat an egg, or hold a pen, or ride a bicycle. But nor for that matter could we design a building, solve an equation, or compose a symphony. In these, as in countless other tasks, we feel our way forward, as Polanyi put it, following a trail and relaying it as we go, instead of executing a predetermined and fully articulated program of explicit rules or representations. It's not that there are no rules at all, but rather than furnishing the pegs that underpin the landscape of action, they more resemble signposts in the landscape itself, which point us in the direction we need to go. They are what we call rules of thumb, offering guidance without specification. In practice, they're more ostensive than prescriptive. Once set upon a course, we rely upon the reservoir of personal knowledge to carry on. To strip away the veneer of articulate representations for Polanyi was to reveal this reservoir, and these are his words, to lay bare the inarticulate manifestations of intelligence by which we know things in a purely personal manner, and to open up an immense domain, an immense mental domain, not only of knowledge, but of manners, of laws, and of the many different arts by which man knows how to use, comply with, enjoy, or live by, without specifiably knowing its contents. That was a quotation from Polanyi. Now here, as elsewhere, Polanyi could hardly have been more emphatic that what his inquiries had disclosed was a realm of mind. He called it a mental domain, the existence of which had been previously unacknowledged, or that until then had not been accorded its due. And yet his discovery was destined to suffer an ignominious fate at the hands of subsequent social theory, which had, albeit belatedly, realized that human beings are only present in the world because they have, or rather are, their bodies. And this realization is commonly traced back to an influential essay on techniques of the body, Technique du corps, penned by the ethnologist Marcel Mauss in 1934. Drawing attention to the sheer diversity of postures and gestures involved in such everyday tasks as walking, carrying loads, eating, and sleeping, Mauss realized that there is more to this than the kind of idiosyncratic variation that marks one individual from another, and that in French would be called habitude. It's not just a matter of what you might happen to pick up, or conversely of what you might improvise for yourselves. Some children, as Mauss noted, are more inclined than others to imitate the behavior they observe around them. And yet both weak and strong imitators, if they belong to the same society, are similarly educated by example and correction into forms of bodily comportment deemed proper to their age and status. So to denote these forms, socially imposed rather than individually acquired, attributable to education rather than imitation, and thus enshrined in a tradition, Mauss co-opted the Latin term habitus. Now Mauss's prospectus for a comparative ethnology of techniques of the body was sketchy at best, and was soon forgotten by the anthropology of the time. With its fragmentary catalogue of apparently miscellaneous customs from around the world, the essay was so anachronistic in its formulation, and yet so far ahead of its time in terms of the questions it opened up, that it largely fell on deaf ears. And so when, some 40 years later, sociologist Pierre Bourdieu reintroduced the habitus as the centerpiece of a theory of practice centered upon the dispositions of the body, few recalled that he was following the precedent set by Modos, nor did Bourdieu go out of his way to acknowledge the fact. And perhaps it's just as well that he didn't, because he took the term in a quite different sense. By habitus, Bourdieu means a kind of practical mastery, a capacity to improvise conduct strategically attuned to the conditions of its production. That is, neither picked up haphazardly, as one might pick up an infection, simply through personal contact, nor deliberately inculcated through precept and prescription. Every society, Bourdieu writes, this is a quotation again, provides for structural exercises tending to transmit this or that form of practical mastery. They are exercises in which a body participates not as an instrumental means for the implementation or expression of a moral tradition, but as a productive agent in its own right. Its postures and gestures, far from merely expressing thoughts and feelings already imparted through education into societal values, are in themselves ways of thinking and feeling through which these values are continually reproduced. Now, crucially, according to Bourdieu, the principles of mastery that are passed on by way of these exercises never rise to what he calls the level of discourse. Psychologically, they remain underground, beyond the reach of consciousness. They cannot be articulated or rendered explicit. Ineffable, incommunicable, and therefore inimitable by any conscious effort. These principles are given body, made body, or literally embodied, as Bourdieu puts it, by the hidden persuasion of an implicit pedagogy. Now, so far as I know, Bourdieu makes no reference to the work of Polanyi. He may not even have read it. But there are uncanny parallels between Polanyi's notion of personal knowledge and the particular construction that Bourdieu places upon the habitus. They claim that Polanyi makes for personal knowledge that it cannot be articulated or specified, that it is non-propositional and non-declarative, that it is acquired and deployed without conscious awareness, or in a word that it is tacit, but that it nevertheless subtends and makes possible everything we think and do. That is precisely the claim that Bourdieu makes for the habitus. So it's not surprising that for the generation of social scientists brought up on Bourdieu, and I am one of them, the temptation is to look back at Polanyi through Bourdieuvian spectacles and to jump to the conclusion that by personal or tacit knowledge, he meant a knowledge whose proper domain is the body. Indeed, Polanyi has even been criticized in his insistence on the division between tacit and explicit knowledge. He's been criticized for reproducing a Cartesian dualism of body and mind. In the vocabulary of many analysts, tacit and embodied have come to mean the same thing. And yet nothing could have been further from Polanyi's intention, because as I've already noted, he was emphatic in his verdict that personal knowledge inhabits the mind. If there's a division between the explicit and the tacit, it is between two regions of the mind, and not between mind and body. Now, in this talk, I want to take issue with the notion of embodied knowledge by focusing on what I shall call habit, the habit of craftsmen, artisans, musicians, and scholars. And my argument has two components. The first is to show that the habits that enable practitioners to move on in the accomplishment of their tasks are not so much sedimented in the body as generated and enacted in an attentive and kinesthetic correspondence with tools, materials, and environment. And the second is to insist that this is as true of working with words as it is of working with non-verbal materials. To reach the domain of habitual practice, then, does not mean giving up on words or probing beneath them, but it does mean giving up on the techniques of intellectual distillation that allow words to float to the top and habits to sink to the bottom of some imaginary column of consciousness. And this is how we often imagine it. Here's consciousness. We think of consciousness as a sort of column. And we put words up here. And we put habits down here. It's a very common way of thinking. Words are right at the top of consciousness, habits are deep down below. And these techniques of distillation, I contend, are themselves sustained and reproduced in the practices of the academy. For who, other than academics, who would be so pompous as to exclude from discourse anything that cannot be expressed in formal propositional terms? Who else would dismiss as inarticulate or even sublinguistic any expressions that do not conform to standards of logical rigour? It's in their minds and theirs alone that the myth persists of the silent craftsman, apparently stuck dumb when challenged to tell of what he does or how he does it. True, the craftsman may not be able to spell it out in explicit detail, but this does not mean that he is lost for words. It's one thing to argue that habits resist explication, quite another that they resist verbalization. And that the two have become confused owes much to ambiguities in the notion of the tacit, and it's to these that I want to turn first of all. And to Wittgenstein, the early Wittgenstein, whereof one cannot speak, concluded Ludwig Wittgenstein in the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, thereof one must be silent. And taken literally, this austere pronouncement would consign to an ocean of silence all ways of knowing and doing, all wisdom and experience, save that which can be expressed linguistically or mathematically in the form of logically interconnected propositions. Now it was Polanyi's contention, of course, that these expressions amounted to no more than the tip of an iceberg, the overwhelming mass of which lay submerged beneath the waves. So Polanyi's idea, which is very often found in the literature, is to imagine this huge iceberg, and here is the water level, and this here is the domain of explicit knowledge, and all of this, the base of the iceberg, is tacit. This was, I spelled this out in case you know. This is Michael Polanyi. Now, Polanyi's purpose was not to denigrate this submarine dimension, but to highlight its contribution to thought and practice. The things of which we cannot speak, he would say, are also things without which we cannot do. Or as he put it, introducing a set of lectures entitled The Tacit Dimension, we know more than we can tell. But why did he choose this word tacit to refer to this untold and untellable residue? This word here is problematic. Why did he choose the word tacit? The word itself is tantalizingly vague. It's derived from the Latin tacere, to be silent. And it refers in the first place to that which remains unvoiced. And yet, voiced sounds need not be verbal. I could sing, for example. and verbal utterances need have no explicit propositional content. Because when I say, oh shit, what are we to make, for example, of a song without words? And what of an utterance, the force of which is illocutionary, such as a warning, a greeting, or a direction? And conversely, of many things that could be stated explicitly, we may prefer to keep our mouths shut for reasons of discretion or security. As the philosopher of science Harry Collins explains, in an extended commentary on the tacit-explicit distinction, whether a matter is voiced or even verbal is not really the issue for Polanyi. The tacit for him is not so much the opposite of the explicit as of the explicable. It consists of things, then, that cannot, by their very nature, be explicated. So what then does Polanyi mean by explication? And two terms keep cropping up in his account of what explication entails, namely specification and articulation. Now, to specify means to pin things down to fixed coordinates of reference, and to articulate means to join them up into a complete structure. So, for example, we specify when we plot, suppose we have a graph, y, x, and we plot a point here, and a point here, we specify this point, we specify those points, and then we draw a line connecting the two. That's to articulate. So we specify when we plot dots on a graph, or enter values in an equation, or type words on a page. We articulate when we join them up, when we join dots with lines, values with plus or minus signs, words with spaces. And as these examples indicate, explication is not limited to verbal forms. It can also be algebraic or mathematical, or expressed in the peculiar language of symbolic logic. And it can also occur in the conventions of musical notation, where each note is specified by a dot, and where the dots are joined into phrases by a ligature. So I could have a manuscript of a bit of music, okay, and I could have this note and this note. Okay, there are two notes which I specified, and then draw a ligature between the two. Again, it's the same thing. We're joining, articulating specified dots. So what do the graph, the mathematical equation, the written sentence, and the scored phrase have in common? What they have in common is that they are all absolutely silent. Where everything is pinned down and joined up, nothing can move. And without movement, there can be no sound. So specification and articulation, while they may be the keys to logical explication, lock the doors to movement, to sound, and to feeling. They stop it up. And this brings us to a rather surprising result. It is that nothing so effectively silences the world than rendering it in explicit propositional terms. Indeed, it is the explicit that is tacit, not the reservoir of habit or know-how for which Polanyi reserves the term. Habit, on the other hand, is turbulent and sometimes noisy. It swirls around in between the points that explicit knowledge joins up, like waters flowing around and between the islands of an archipelago. So I think we've been persistently misled by the analogy of the iceberg, with the picture it presents of explicit knowledge at the tip and the mass of inexplicable know-how below. For far from having come to rest, frozen in submarine psychocorporeal depths, know-how is restless, fluid, and dynamic. And above all, it is not deposited as a stable substrate. housed in lower levels of consciousness, but is fundamentally animate, immanent in the sensuousness of a body that is mobile, alive, and open to the world. Such a body, unified not anatomically, but in its affective resonances, far from retreating into silence, dwells in sound. Habits, in short, are not embodied, rather the body in its habitation of the world is ensounded. Consider what happens, for example, I'm sorry I can't demonstrate it now, consider what happens when I play a single note on an open string of my cello. On the score, the note is specified by a dot, crossed by a stave line. Right I've written there. There it is, silent, lifeless, and inert. But as soon as I begin to play, it erupts into sound, into life. So the notated point becomes a sustained and vibrant line. And this is no simple matter. And to succeed in it, my body must be finely balanced and tense throughout, with an acute awareness of its immediate environments, while my right arm, elbow and wrist undergo a controlled movement to ensure that the position where the bow touches the string between the bridge and the fingerboard remains more or less constant. So the sound arises from this complex choreography of highly attentive, mutually attuned movements. It is not possible to play without also feeling, that is, without continually attending and responding both to one's own movements and to those going on in one's surroundings. Indeed, in blowing a note on the cello, as in any other task, as even Polanyi acknowledged, we feel our way forward. And yet in the appeal to the tacit, this entire domain of feeling is blanked out, silenced and still. So tacit is a misnomer, the wrong word, for the dimension of habitual practice. So, by what better term should it be known? What can we use instead? And I'd like to borrow a concept from educational theorist Stefano Hani and the literary scholar Fred Moulton. It sounds rather nasty, but it's practicality. I'll write it down because actually I don't like the word. I don't like this word very much, but it's the best that I can come up with so far. For Moulton and Hani, hapticality lies in a feel for feeling others feeling you. In effect, hapticality fills the void of the tacit. Where the tacit is silent, the haptic is noisy. Where the tacit is embodied, the haptic is animate. Where the tacit is sunk into the depths of being, the haptic is open and alive to others and to the world. And with this we can return to Wittgenstein's injunction from the Tractatus. The composer, John Cage, began his lecture on nothing, presented in New York in 1949, by declaring, "I have nothing to say, and I am saying it." And behind the play of words, Cage was being deeply serious. We could read his declaration as a forthright rebuke to the author of the Tractatus. For Cage refuses to be silenced. His words may have no object, no referent, no matter to convey, yet he has a voice and will speak. And it behoves us to listen. For by speaking, we humans make ourselves present in the world. And by listening, we pay attention and respond. So Cage wanted to awaken in his listeners their sense of what he called responsibility. And nor need this responsibility be limited to the sphere of human relations. Other kinds of beings or other phenomena make their presence felt in manifold ways, and we should attend to them too. We hear the calls of birds, the rustling of wind in the trees, the sound of the waterfall, and we can tell much from them, whether the birds are calm or agitated, whether the wind is gentle or strong, whether the river is dry or in spate. Neither the birds, nor the trees, nor the water have anything to say, but there they are, saying it, pronouncing their very existence in the world. So, does practicality lie on the far side of speaking or of telling? Well, only if, with Wittgenstein, we limit speaking to logical expression, or with Polanyi, limit telling to literate articulation. Yet in truth, no words could be spoken, nor could any story be told, without feeling. Both speaking and telling have another side. They have a side that, just as in playing the cello, is enacted in performance, at the moment when connected points give way to swirling lines. Now, at this stage of the argument, I want to focus on telling, and I'll return in due course to speaking when I turn from work to words. Just recall that for Polanyi, we can know more than we can tell. I want to argue to the contrary, that we can tell all we know, but only because there's more to telling than articulation. To tell, in English, is one of those ancient verbs that comes to us already densely packed with multiple layers of meaning. Originally, it was to count or to reckon, as does the teller who tops up the bill, what you do in the till, whose modern representative is the accountant. An account rendered in words rather than numbers, however, is a narrative, a story. So what is the difference between the accountant and the storyteller? Both are telling. One adds up, assembling in rows or columns initially separate point-specific entries. That's the work of articulation. But the other goes along, finding a way between and through the accountant's entry points. So storytellers are wayfarers, and like all wayfarers, they need to attend to things as they go, to recognize subtle cues in the environment and to respond to them with judgment and precision. They need to be able to tell, for example, where animals have been from their tracks, how the weather is about to change, how the river runs. And that's the sense of telling I invoked a moment ago in relation to the birds, the wind, and the waterfall. And it's precisely what Cage meant by responsibility. Now, each of these two latter ways of telling, evinced respectively in storytelling and in responsibility, each of these entails the other. Because it's through having their stories told that novices learn to attend to things and to what they afford in the situations of their current practice. And contrariwise, it is because of the resulting feel for things, a kind of intimacy that comes from sharing a life together, that experienced practitioners can tell their stories. And the capacity to tell in these twin senses is critical to the practice of any craft. And it is perhaps the principal criterion by which the master can be distinguished from the novice. On the one hand, stories allow practitioners to tell of what they know without specifying it. They carry no information in themselves, no coded messages or representations.